Before you can design an experiment, you should first ask the questions you would like to be answered. Second, make an educated guess or state your hypothesis. And lastly, make a detailed description and explanation of the procedure of your experiment. Past experiences and observations suggest certain hypotheses. Theoretical considerations may also play a major role in arriving at a hypothesis. After formulating a hypothesis, an experimental procedure is designed for its verification. The experimental procedure consists of 4 parts. First, the selection of the appropriate materials for the test. Second, specification of the variable to be measured. Third, selection of the procedure to be used in the measurements of the variable. And lastly, specification of the procedure to be used to determine whether the measurements support the hypothesis. To specify the first 2 parts of the procedure is fairly easy. Not much statistics is needed to decide what materials to be used in the test and how to specify the variables to be measured. On the other hand, parts 3 and 4 cannot be done unless the experimenter has some knowledge of statistics. The experimenter has to make an experimental design which includes the procedure and how the measurements are to be made, the number of replicates, and how they can be used to test the hypothesis. A research design is a complete sequence of steps or procedures that need to be followed when obtaining the needed data during an investigation. It serves as a guide during the actual experimentation. It minimizes the cost of experimentation while maximizing the gathered information relevant to the problem. It also validates the statistical test because it takes into consideration all the assumptions that went through the process of deriving the various statistics. Design of the experiment depends on the type of research being undertaken and the nature of the conditions under which the investigation is done. It is dictated by the question it has to answer. Since each problem is unique, it follows that it also requires a unique design. A research design is embodied in a research proposal, which is a written plan about what the researcher proposes to do in his investigation. In planning a research design, the experimenter identifies the subject of the study, the variables, the controls, the experimental and control groups, the instruments and devices to be used in the experiment, and the statistical tools needed for the analysis of the data collected. The subject of the study is the main material being used in the experiment. It is also called experimental unit. It can be a person, an animal, a plot in the field, a plant, a leaf, or a model of a device. The experimental unit may be subjected to different treatments depending upon the objectives of the study. A treatment denotes any procedure done on the experimental unit. The effect of this procedure is to be measured and analyzed. In a research design, there are certain basic principles to be followed. The principles which are always present in a research design are replication, randomization, local control, and control of extraneous variables. Replication is a very necessary element in the design of any research. Doing just the basic experiment is not enough. The experiment should be repeated several times to find an estimate of variations among observations on the group of subjects treated alike. Replication allows the researcher to assess the significance of the observed differences. Only through several repetitions of the experiment will make statistical tests of significance possible. Randomization refers to the assignment of the experimental subjects to the treatments by chance. It is done to create equivalent groups prior to the experiment. It tends to average out differences among groups. It reduces possible bias in comparative experiments. It also assures a valid or unbiased estimate of population parameters and the validity of the statistical test of significance. Local control is done when balancing, grouping, and blocking of experimental units are employed in the adaptive design. Experimental units are allotted to a block in such a manner that the units within the block are relatively homogeneous. Experimental units may be blocked according to certain characteristics such as height, age, weight, gender, grade level, pH level, and so on. In an experimental design, we have to make sure that no outsider or extraneous variables may affect the experimental subjects. The control of extraneous variables is necessary. Identical conditions must be provided for the control and experimental groups. These two groups should differ only in terms of the absence, or the control, or the presence of the treatment or experimental. The principles of the experimental design can be applied to single factor, two factor, and three or more factor experiments.